Hello everyone, welcome to NR Dialogue, and we are in episode number 4, focusing on the sustainable natural rubber road ahead. Sawadee namaste. Welcome you to all this special event on the NR natural rubber. As you know, this program is owned and managed by Technobase in cooperation with Mr. John Jacob, a rubber industry analyst. And I'd like to introduce to you about Technobase and its services for what we are doing for the rubber industries. Let me show you a short presentation on the Technobase. Okay, that's about the Technobase, the services that we offer for the rubber industries. I'm hoping that you find useful, and if you have any interest in any of our services, you can reach out to me. I'd like to give you additional information about the rubber technology training programs that we have on the rubber technology online training. Probably we are the specialist in the world, providing a huge number of training topics for the rubber industries. And this is basically under the know-how webinar project. And we have more than 40 well-experienced and knowledgeable experts as a resource person covering broad range of subjects, from basics to the advanced and practical issues. So, and we have currently we have developed 250 short topics as an online training, which is starting 30 minutes to 3 hours long. We're still making more, adding more subjects for the benefit of the rubber industry professionals. we have master classes as well, which last from 1 day to 10 day long. We develop 20 plus topics. And we have a diploma program also, rubber industry technology and management, which is a 3-month long program. So a totally online program. So if you're interested in any of these topics, you can check it out, knowhow-webinars.com. I also like to introduce this program today is natural rubber. We have a master class on the natural rubber economics. We are hosting on the 15th June. The instructor is Mr. Joe Jacob. So if you're interested, you can check out knowhow-webinars.com as well in the natural rubber economics. So now we are into today's episode, and our dialogue focus on the sustainable natural rubber road ahead. I'm pleased to introduce our host, Mr. Joe Jacob. He's a rubber industry analyst. Let me give you a brief intro to Joe Jacob. He has more than 30 years experience and recognized as a global industry analyst with extensive experience in the analyzing rubber market, forecasting industry trends, and formulating long-term policies and development plans for natural rubber sector. He served the Association of Natural Rubber Producing Countries, we call it as ANRPC, based in Kuala Lumpur, as its senior economist for 11 years. Before that, he worked for the Rubber Board of India by holding various positions for 23 years. Mr. Joe Jacob is well experienced, well known rubber industry analyst. He is hosting today's episode. May I invite Mr. Joe?
Hi all. Today we are here for the 4th episode of NR Dialogue. The 4th episode has a specialty. Instead of covering a particular country or a geographical region, today we are having an enlightening discussion on one of the most important hot topics in the global NR industry. Today's NR Dialogue is exclusively devoted to sustainable natural rubber, which is popularly known as SNR. Sustainable development is an approach to the economic development without compromising with the quality of environment for future generations. In the name of economic development, there can be environmental damages in the form of land degradation, soil erosion, air and water pollution, or deforestation. The price of such damages often exceeds the additional gain from the economic development. This is an issue in focus. The United Nations Rio Earth Summit held in June 1992 in Rio de Janeiro was one of the first major UN initiatives to bring international cooperation and build a global platform to discuss issues relating to sustainability. Sustainability has become a buzzword in the development paradigm since then. In the case of natural rubber industry, sustainable practices have been encouraged and promoted by some of the natural rubber producing countries through various policies. For example, there have been policies in a few countries to restrict rubber cultivation in forest lands. There have been policies to discourage the practices that damage soil quality and environment. There have been policies for promoting soil quality. However, such policies had several limitations. For example, the policies existed over the past few decades were confined to few countries only. Another limitation, the policies did not cover all aspects of sustainable development. The policies lacked a proper framework that comprehensively cover all aspects of sustainable practices. The policies had not adopted a holistic approach. They largely adopted segmented approaches rather than applying to the whole spectrum of the rubber value chain. Another limitation was that they lacked systematic accreditation and certification system. It is in this context that the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber, GPSNR, assumes significance. The GPSNR brings together various stakeholders of rubber industry to a common ground based on fairness, equity, and environmental sustainability. GPSNR is a multi-stakeholder initiative aiming to address the sustainability issues arising around the natural rubber supply chain. Today's NR Dialogue, episode number 4, we are fortunate to have with us the most authoritative and resourceful guest to speak on sustainable natural rubber, or SNR. Our guest of the day is none other than Mr. Stefano Savi, the director of the GPSNR, Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber. Before coming to this position, Mr. Stefano was the Global Outreach and Engagement Director for the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, RSPO, Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, RSPO, overseeing the design and implementation of RSPO Global Outreach and Engagement Strategy. A physics graduate, Stefano believes in building conditions for people to act freely and creatively so that they can co-create a path forward. He believes success is the next step together in the right direction. With immense pleasure, let me invite our guest of the day, Mr. Stefano, to join us. Hi, Mr. Stefano.
Hello, thank you, John. Thank you, Param, for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, good evening, Mr. Stefano. We are extremely happy to have you here to share your insights on SNR. I presume that it is around 4:15 p.m. in your time zone. For this live session, we have participants from different parts of the world. So before we start the conversation, could you please briefly share with the audience your native place, your journey with the plantation industry, something like that to start with?
Thank you, John. And again, thank you to everyone for listening in wherever you are. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm currently in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, which is my hometown and has been my hometown for the past 10 years now. I am, well, you said much about me with very humbling words actually in the introduction, and I won't repeat myself too much, but in your words too much. But yes, I'm a physicist by training, and I think that's a big part of how my brain thinks. Yeah, that part of my development has really shaped my my intellect, I would say. And I've had a very varied experience in my life before embarking on this sustainability journey about 10 years ago now. My first post was in communications in the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, where I then became the Outreach and Engagement Director. And indeed, now almost 3 years ago, I was contacted by a group of stakeholders that wanted to start a multi-stakeholder initiative in natural rubber, and I jumped at the opportunity because I found it very interesting. I think it's you know, the production of agri-commodities, especially tropical agricultural commodities, is one of the areas of development that is more challenging and more rewarding, I would say. Yeah. For the whole world, we desperately need these commodities, and we desperately need to make sure that we produce these commodities today in a way that we continue producing these commodities tomorrow. And that's what sustainability is. I think you said it somehow in your words as well. So I'm very happy to be here today and to tell you as much as I can about the little I know about sustainability and the work and history of GPSNR so far.
Thank you for that introduction, brief introduction. So to start with, could you please explain in very simple terms, what is sustainable natural rubber? Because often some of the farmers asked me this question, what is sustainable natural rubber? And what are the environmental, social, and economic aspects of sustainable natural rubber? Could you put these terms in very simple terms?
Sure. I think the best way to understand what sustainable natural rubber is to understand what unsustainable natural rubber is. And I don't think it's a fault of the crop to be sustainable or a merit of the crop to be sustainable or unsustainable. Actually, when we look at natural rubber, especially, I think the crop is probably one of the best positioned crops to be produced in a way that doesn't harm people or the economy or the environment. Yeah. Natural rubber is a perennial crop, as you know better than me. Yeah, you're much more of an expert on natural rubber than I am. Yeah, it requires very little input, and it's the practices of extraction of natural rubber are also practices that have, by right and by design, very little impact, a negative impact, yeah, on the environment and on people. But there are some issues, yeah, that are linked to natural rubber production. And there are issues in natural rubber as there are for other commodities. Yeah, and these issues, specifically in natural rubber, they very much vary depending on where the price of natural rubber is. Yeah, I would say that when the prices are high, the issues that we have in natural rubber are the issues that are linked to the willingness towards expansion, yeah, of plantations. Yeah, and these issues arise when this plantations expansion is done at the expense of forest, yeah, or is done at the expense of local indigenous land, yeah, and villages, yeah, and with practices of development that do not respect the people, the planet, and the economy, yeah. So there's many of these issues that we have seen, for example, when the prices were high at the beginning of the 2010s, yeah. For example, in the Mekong Delta, in certain areas in Africa, yeah, and we've had issues that have caused also outrage, yeah, in the general public, in certain geographies where there's more, definitely more attention maybe for civil society and other groups about these development practices, yeah. But I was mentioning that there's also issues when the prices instead are very low, as we've seen in the past years, yeah. And the issues of sustainability that are very close to my heart actually now and in this period are the issues linked to farmers' livelihoods, for example. Yeah, so it's important that we take into account how farmers can sustain production and sustain their families, yeah, and obtain a fair price for rubber that includes what we call the externalities cost that these farmers are actually bearing. Yeah. So what we're seeing is that, actually when a farmer is pushed on prices that they have to use less sustainable means for developing rubber, and usually the costs or hidden costs of these unsustainable means, like the use of protective equipment, for example, the use of chemicals or methods that could potentially be harming to the farmers themselves, but also the sheer fact that they would not be able to provide to their families. These are costs that the farmers are paying and that the industry is not internalizing. Yeah. So making sure that we account for these costs is one of the things that we must look into to make rubber more sustainable. Now, while this, I would say, describes what are the issues, yeah, one thing that I think it's important to also understand is that sustainability is a moving post, yeah, and it will always be, yeah. And I think there's been an issue in the way we've been communicating about sustainability in the past years, where we have made sustainability look like a bar, a very clear bar that we can, once it's jumped, then we are covered and everything is clean. Yeah, and that is never the case, right? Is as saying that when you get your degree of law, for example, that then you're a perfect lawyer and you will never be failing, right? That's not how things work. Yeah. The law, the practices change, things get updated, and you need to remain up to date as a professional if you want to call yourself a sustainable professional. Yeah, someone that can practice their profession today in a way that they can also practice it tomorrow. That's the definition of sustainability. So I think to me that is very important. Yeah, that we understand that this is a moving post and that sustainability is a learning journey. Yeah. But there are things that we can take into account, and I'm happy to talk about this more in, as we have this conversation about what GPSNR is doing and how we can definitely help moving companies and all players in the natural rubber value chain towards more sustainable practices.
Okay, thank you. That's very simple. You put the concept very simple and clear. Thank you. So, Stefano, GPSNR is the most authoritative organization for any information on sustainable natural rubber. Could you please share information about the objectives, functions, and organizational structure of GPSNR? You may mention the year and the context in which GPSNR was established.
Sure, thank you, John. Well, I think you also mentioned it in your presentation at the beginning in your introduction. Really, the scope of GPSNR is that of creating a fair, equitable, and environmentally sound natural rubber value chain. And I guess when we look at the context in which GPSNR was formed, to better understand the direction this GPSNR is taking as we design the organization, yeah, because I would say that we're still teething, yeah, as a being, yeah, we're quite young still, so we're still designing some of the processes. But it's important to understand the context and how the natural rubber value chain is set up, yeah. So in the past, I would say since the 90s, yeah, certification and accredited verification of practices as being the main direction and main goal, yeah, when we're looking at sustainability. And I think that these systems of certification still bear many advantages, yeah, when they can be properly applied. I would say in natural rubber, we have a situation that is a bit peculiar, and we have seen certification not being able yet, at least, to really make a dent in the amount of material that is certified that is entering the supply chain. And this is because of the design of the supply chain itself. So about 70% of the natural rubber that is produced globally goes into tires. Yeah, and we have a handful of companies globally that are buying this rubber. Some of these companies are buying, to the extent of the hundreds of thousands, even millions of tons of natural rubber per year. Yeah, and this means effectively when you look at the yields, yeah, on the other side of the supply chain, and you take into account the fact that 85% of the production of natural rubber is coming from smallholders with 1 to 2 hectares of plantation. This means that these companies are sourcing from hundreds of thousands, if not millions of smallholders at a time, each of them. So to have an approach that is linear and looking through your supply chain, as if you're looking into a pipe, yeah, getting you the natural rubber, is very complicated, yeah, to have the better transparency and a better understanding of where you're sourcing from, and looking at ways that you can clean up your supply chain from bad practices, for example, with the traditional methods. Yeah, so I think there was a desire that was exacerbated by the issues around unsustainable natural rubber development that happened in the beginning of the last decade. Yeah, there was a desire for many of the stakeholders around natural rubber some of the tire makers, especially initially, but also the end users, as well as producers and civil society organizations to come together and create a multi-stakeholder organization that could define a new set of criteria, and a framework for what sustainability means in natural rubber, and find ways that we could cooperate as a multi-stakeholder ensemble, to put into practices these targets, these objectives. And this is really where GPSNR was formed. We started 3 years ago with some very much needed funding from some of the major tire makers that were working under the World Business Council for Sustainable Development on a project called the Tire Industry Project, that probably many of the listeners here are familiar with. So with the funding from TIP, and then we had this initial funding, seed funding for GPSNR, then we moved towards having now an organization that is a fully fledged multi-stakeholder organization where all of the income is coming equitably from membership fees that are paid in equal parts from the different parts of the value chain. We've also managed to have smallholders join in GPSNR, and I'm pleased to say that more than 100 independent smallholders are today members of GPSNR, and this together with our businesses, both on the processing, on the manufacturing, and on the end user side of natural rubber, are representing about, I would say, 60 or 60+% of the total natural rubber volume in the market today. So in just less than 3 years, we're, I would say, representative of more than the majority of the natural rubber volume, that is in the market.
Okay, interesting. So, Mr. Stefano, you mentioned that even smallholders are members of GPSNR. So let me know what are the eligibility criteria to become a member of GPSNR?
Yeah, we have different criteria depending on the place where a stakeholder sits on the value chain. Our definition for smallholders currently is that the farm should be less than 50 hectares, which is quite a high, already a high number, I would say, for smallholders, but that's taking into account the differences in different geographies. But another important factor is that the labor on the farm should be coming from the smallholder, and the income should be coming to the family. So that defines, I would say, these things together define most of the smallholders that we have in natural rubber, while keeping some leeway. There's currently no monetary requirement for smallholders to join GPSNR. And the idea at this stage is to really get smallholders on board, and we are currently in the process of developing a policy framework for smallholders, with targets that smallholders will have to follow up and abide to, in the future. This policy framework for smallholders is actually will be a simplified version, of what is actually currently already in place for the companies that are joining GPSNR instead. So companies that join GPSNR, no matter where they sit in the supply chain, either producers or processors or traders or manufacturers or end users, they will have to abide to and sign up to the GPSNR policy framework, which is a set of commitments, that the company would undersign, and the company will have to publish a policy that is in line with this framework within 6 months of becoming a member of GPSNR. So I think one of the major breakthrough that we had in GPSNR in the past 3 years was that now basically all of our members, already have published or are in the process of publishing policies that are aligned with this framework, which means effectively that more than 60% now of the natural rubber in the market is covered by commitments that are in line with this framework. And this is a first for the industry. And it was one of the key goals that we had set up in the beginning for GPSNR, to start aligning the demands of buyers and the requirements around sustainability. that are now defined through this framework.
Okay. That's interesting. In fact, the eligibility criteria and some of the requirements interesting. So I understand that GPSNR has different working groups. So could you please throw some light on the various working groups of GPSNR and their focus areas?
Correct. So there's definitely many working groups, and I would say that one of the strengths of GPSNR so far has been the very direct involvement in the, also in the arms and legs work of the organization from our members. Yeah, and we have members of staff of our members that are taking a lot of time out of their daily jobs, I would say, although sustainability is becoming part of their daily jobs more and more. Yeah, but to give this time to GPSNR and to the work that we're doing. We started, I think before I get into the working groups, it's important to understand what is the overarching setup of GPSNR. Yeah, I mentioned that the multi-stakeholder nature of GPSNR is very important in setting the foundations of the decision-making of the organization. So all decisions within GPSNR and the representation in all of the bodies that are decision-making bodies in GPSNR, from the General Assembly to the Executive Committee to the working groups, is done in a multi-stakeholder way. So there's a representation from all these stakeholder groups, yeah, the producers, the smallholder producers, the PPTs, yeah, the producers, processors, and traders, the manufacturers and tire makers, and the end users, as well as civil society. They all have a seat in all of these groups, yeah, and there's consensus-based decision making. So no decision can be taken unless all of these stakeholder groups agrees on moving forward. Yeah. So with this, we set up the organization. Yeah. And we started taking into account a framework that is set by an organization that is called the Accountability Framework Initiative. Yeah. And this is a group of civil society organizations that have developed a framework to help either companies or multi-stakeholder initiatives to set targets and move towards more sustainable production of commodities. Yeah, and this framework has three pillars. Yeah, the first pillar is to set commitments. The second pillar is to move towards implementation of these commitments, and the third pillar is the monitoring and evaluation of the progress. Yeah, so this is the steps. Yeah, the three pillars that we also taken into GPSNR in developing our goals. Yeah, so we started with the working group. Yeah, there was the strategy and objective working group, is still actually up and running. Yeah, and in these working groups, what we did at the beginning was to identify, okay, what is the desired state? Where do we want to achieve? What does the natural rubber value chain that is sustainable, how does it look like? And what is the state at which we are today? So we did this exercise and we identified key gaps, and these key gaps became then the streams of work for new working groups in GPSNR. So the first gap we found was that the representation of smallholders was missing, yeah, and the voice of smallholder was not being heard in decision making, in preparing policies, in having actions around sustainability. So we decided to have a smallholder representation working group, and through this group we have onboarded these 100+ smallholders that are now part of GPSNR. Then we looked at the policy, yeah, and as I mentioned, there was a plethora of different policies and different expectations on sustainability, yeah, and how to align those policies. So with what we call the policy toolbox working group, we designed the framework for GPSNR, which is now published, yeah, the set of commitment that I've mentioned before. And we are now looking at creating an implementation guidance, which is basically the second pillar, yeah, that I was discussing before, as well as we have approved this year reporting requirements for members. So members on a yearly basis will be reporting back to GPSNR on their progress towards meeting those commitments. Yeah. We also found a gap in terms of the ability of producers to operate sustainably if there are no financial and non-financial incentives to do so. So in other commodities and in other example of demanding for sustainability, yeah, what usually happens is that the buyer demands sustainable material. There is an investment from the producer to have more sustainable practices, and then this is rewarded with some kind of premium by the market. But of course, if there's no capital that is possible to invest, like in the case of smallholders in rubber, yeah, it's very difficult, even if there's a demand, to meet this demand. So what we are doing now, we were starting capacity building actions that are financed through our donors funds, as well as our members donations at the moment, yeah. And we're looking at this program starting this year in Thailand, in Cote d'Ivoire, and in Indonesia to start with, looking at agroforestry, looking at diversification of income through agroforestry and other means, looking at access to good planting material, and looking at good agricultural practices, yeah, for which GPSNR has already published some international guidelines, yeah, for GAPs, and we're looking at nationalizing this with the help of local stakeholders and, of course, the agencies that have already done a lot of work in the past in this area, yeah, in the past years. Another aspect, an important working group that GPSNR is working on is what we call the Shared Responsibility Working Group. And here we are discussing a topic that is very much at the heart of the discussion, yeah, and it's how do we create value transfer for better practices. So basically how we reward companies that are better operating. And we have a framework that is going to be voted at the next General Assembly in July that will start looking at the possibility of having a scoring for companies. And this scoring will depend on the actions that you do on both capacity building, on how you verify and check your own practices, yeah, but also how you're buying material from, let's say, compliant or better sources of natural rubber, yeah. And this will drive, and the design is hoping to drive then demand for sustainable natural rubber. We're also looking at the possibility of setting up a rubber trust fund, yeah, well, where funds will be gathered from the industry as well as other donors potentially to then put in place systems for risk management, risk identification, yeah, at scale in the industry. So understanding where are the risks, where are the biggest issues, yeah, and what are the ways that we can utilize these common shared facilities to mitigate those risks and verify that these risks do not present themselves again in the future. So a lot of work, yeah, that has been done in the past 3 years, and still, of course, a lot to come, yeah. But there's, yeah, we are, I guess, in the brink of finalizing the design of our practices and having really an assurance and verification model that will allow us to have finally a product, let's say, on the market, yeah, that we will be able to call a GPSNR product, yeah.
Okay, thank you for the detailed explanation about the working groups. So GPSNR, so another activity, the GPSNR organizes capacity building programs targeting smallholder farmers. Although established under the initiative of auto tire industry, GPSNR has several farmer-centric activities. So it would be interesting to know more about such a program, means programs targeting smallholder farmers.
Thank you. So that's a very important part of what GPSNR is doing, and I mentioned part of it just now, I would say. So I think it's important to reiterate, yeah, that we cannot expect sustainable practices without reward, yeah, and we cannot expect sustainable practices without incentivizing the sustainable practices, yeah. So this is the reason why the capacity building programs of GPSNR were set up through our capacity building working group. So this is a working group that was set up basically since the beginning of the organization, and we were actually hoping to start programs as far back as a year ago, but unfortunately, because of COVID, we have all been hit by the pandemic, yeah, and this has caused some delays, especially when we're looking at on-the-ground actions. But I'm pleased to say that we're starting, to implement the programs that were designed by this capacity building working group this year, yeah. And I mentioned before, we're starting with a few pilot countries, yeah. We have these countries and the geographies have been selected by the working groups, yeah, on a multi-stakeholder basis. So all decisions have been made in the spirit of GPSNR by all the members that were involved, yeah. And we're starting now these programs, as I mentioned, in Thailand, in Indonesia, and in Cote d'Ivoire to start with. We have funding for these programs. So these are fully funded programs now. A lot of this funding currently is coming from the German Sustainable Development activities, yeah, and the GIZ, for those of you that are familiar with the agency, yeah. So we have donations that are coming from public funds, but we also have donations that are coming from our members directly. Yeah, some of the companies that are in GPSNR are financing this, as well as the funding that is coming from the membership fees in GPSNR going into these programs. Yeah, so we're starting these pilots, and we're looking at different areas. Yeah, one key area, especially for Thailand, we're also having discussions with local stakeholders. Now we have started a local Thai group looking at these developments, where we've had the chance to also interact with RAOT, yeah, in these endeavors, and we're looking specifically at agroforestry here. And we are looking at the ways that we can implement agroforestry and have pilot farms set up and projects to implement agroforestry in plantations and utilize this as a means for income diversification for farmers. So it's important, you know, we've seen in the past that the farmers are negatively affected by the fluctuating prices of natural rubber, and it's important for farmers to diversify, yeah, and have income from other streams as well. And I think it's important, if we want to have a sustainable production of natural rubber, that we ensure that sustainable livelihoods are prioritized for farmers. Yeah, so we're starting these programs. We are also looking at localizing good agricultural practices, yeah, in Thailand. Although there's a lot of work that has been done already by RAOT, yeah, the Rubber Authority in Thailand, yeah, for this. But I think it's important to also bring in the international experience, yeah, and what are international standards into this local endeavors, yeah, and make sure that for reaching sustainability, we do look at local solutions to local issues that work within an international framework, yeah. So we've done the same in Indonesia, where we are also looking importantly at training for farmers. We are also looking at good agricultural practices, again in Indonesia, and localizing this with the local stakeholders. We are also looking in Indonesia at access to certified planting materials, so good clonal material, yeah, and understanding how to promote the demand for this, yeah. There are several issues, as many of you might know, with the market in Indonesia now in terms of moving away from rubber cultivation, and one of the issues is that the yields do not allow for sufficient income, yeah, for farmers to be attracted to rubber cultivation. But there's also an issue with diseases. So another part of what we're doing is to look into disease fighting, yeah. And again, this is not done in isolation. We don't pretend to be the experts of this. There are groups and agencies that have done work on this, but I think it's important to connect this with the needs of the industry and the support that the industry can bring, yeah, to these actions on the ground. And in Ivory Coast, we're also looking at training centers for farmers, and we are collaborating with the FIRCA now in Ivory Coast to set up these programs for farmers, also for good agricultural practices, and understand how we can have better practices for farmers on the ground, also in that geography. Yeah. John, I cannot hear you. I don't know if you're on mute, maybe.
Okay, so in fact, that is interesting to know the various programs, pharma-centric programs being conducted across the world, Ivory Coast, Thailand, and different parts of the world. Quite interesting. My next question is, the discussion point is, GPSNR has a policy framework and a set of policy components for implementing the sustainability agenda. So could you explain how this policy framework has emerged? What was the role of auto tire industry in framing the policy and identifying the policy components? What was the role of other stakeholders, for example, rubber nursery owners, smallholders, large plantations, tappers, women laborers, processors, and NRS porters? What are the role of these other stakeholders in framing the policy of the GPSNR? Could you throw some light on how these policies emerge and what was the role of different stakeholders in framing the policies? Thank you.
Sure, thanks for that. That's a very important question. So I think it's important to say that we built the policy framework on the basis of our governance framework in GPSNR. So this was decided, the policy framework was decided on a multi-stakeholder basis with multi-stakeholder discussions where all different groups of members and stakeholders part of GPSNR had the possibility of being part of the discussion, inputting on the framework, and ultimately voting on the framework, knowing that if even one of the stakeholder groups was against the framework, the decision to approve the framework would not have passed. So I'm very happy to say that when the framework was approved, it was approved with an overwhelming majority of positive votes from the GPSNR members, and these include the smallholders, farmers, as well as the producers, processors, and traders members, the tire maker and manufacturers members, and the end users members, as well as civil society organizations. Now, I'm conscious that representation in GPSNR is still far from being the whole of the industry, but what I would like to say is that the GPSNR doors are open, to anyone that feels was not involved in this. And GPSNR framework is have been agreed, but it's not set in stone. It's something that can be reviewed in the future, And the more we have stakeholders buying into this, the more we make sure that this is a level playing field for all, and something that while being demanding, is also achievable as a target for companies, and for all stakeholders that have to comply to this framework. The framework, as I mentioned, is a set of commitments. So while companies are bound to this framework, we understand that this is not verified in practice from day zero of a company applying or abiding or publishing a policy that is in line with that framework. But I think it's important to understand that by having these policies, a company or an entity that is taking up this framework understands their commitment and their liabilities towards sustainable practices. And basically it's saying, okay, this is what I'm buying into, as a commitment. And if I will be found in breach of this, then I will be seeing myself responsible to playing a role in closing these gaps, towards this policy. And these commitments are available on the GPSNR website. The document is public, so there's a lot of underlying criteria. I won't go into too much details of those, but there's a few key buckets, that we cover. The first one is on legality. So we ask companies to comply to all local and international regulations, when within their operation. There's a commitment to healthy and functioning ecosystems. So this means no conversion of natural ecosystems, for example, and we have a cutoff date for deforestation that is set as of April 2019, which is the time when this the GPSNR started, basically, and we had the first assembly. And we are looking at a definition of forest and a definition of deforestation that is based, for those of the listeners that are familiar with this, with the high conservation value framework and the high carbon stock assessment framework. Yeah. So I won't go too much into the technicalities, but feel free to reach to myself after this webinar if you would like to know more, or visit the GPSNR website. If you look at the policy framework, you will find more information, detailed information on this. We also have a respect of human and labor rights, commitments that are linked to major international conventions. We have a respect for livelihoods, and we talk about living wages in our commitment, as one of the targets. And then we have aspects of the framework that are basically set to ensure that there's a proper application of the framework and a proper monitoring and evaluation of the progress. So this is the what GPSNR is striving to get our members together towards.
Thank you very much. It's interesting to know the role and the involvement of the various stakeholders in framing the policies and also in the identifying the various commitments. Thank you for that. So coming to the advantages from adopting the sustainable practices. So in the perspective of various different stakeholders, for example, it could be a rubber nursery owner, maybe a smallholder farmer, a large plantation company, or a rubber tapper, or a woman plantation worker, rubber processor, a local trader, and a rubber exporter. So in the perspective of various stakeholders on the advantages from adopting sustainable natural rubber may be different. So in the perspective of these various stakeholders, what are the various advantages from adopting the sustainable practices prescribed by the GPSNR? What are the constraints for the different stakeholders for conforming to the prescribed practices? What are the strategies and programs of GPSNR to overcome those challenges? Thank you.
Thank you, John. That's an interesting question. I think there's two ways I would like to respond to that question. There's usually two types of people in the audience when I speak about sustainability. There's a type of person that is more akin to collaboration and doing things together, right? And I would say for that type of person, well, the advantages are the advantages towards our global commons. I think many of us and the legislation together with many of us is now catching up towards the unintended harm we are doing to the environment and our global commons when we have production of commodities that is unsustainable. And I think it's important that we start sooner rather than later to have this type of view also when we look at natural rubber. To not think that the production of natural rubber is already sustainable or is perfect, and to look at the gaps and have a good go at understanding these issues in the gaps. We've discussed these issues before, right? The issues around farmers' livelihoods, and sustainability aims at closing the gap of livelihoods and towards living income, and this and living wages, for farmers, but also closing the gap towards the depletion of our natural resources, And at the end of the day, it's it's not the world that needs to survive. We need to survive, and we cannot survive without a natural environment, and I think for those that have this type of approach to things, that's how I would close that conversation. And I think this should be a good enough call to start doing things sustainably. But I also understand that there are persons and people in the audience that feel more of a need for self-determination. And I know there might be some climate skeptics also in the audience, and people that feel the sustainability is a language that they use in certain countries where people can afford it, for example, or that it's a demand that is for the rich, or it's a demand that is neo-colonialist, even demand at some point. Yeah. And what I would say for those is that, by hook or by crook, this is a market, and the market is starting to demand sustainable practices. There's legislation in most of the main markets that are demanding natural rubber that is going towards higher standards for sustainable production and due diligence. Yeah, we're seeing this in Europe, we're seeing this in the US, and I'm pretty sure we're going to be seeing this in China, because that's usually how things work. Yeah. As a matter of fact, we already have members that are from mainland China also in GPSNR. Yeah, so there's interest on this. So this is the future, and I think if you are willing to self-determine your future, then you better move first rather than being a follower. Yeah, and that's the advantage that I see for the industry, that of making sure that you invest now, either with your time, yeah, and with resources. Being part of the discussion, understanding at least what are the gaps that your company or wherever you are sitting in the value chain, the gaps in your work that you could fill to meet these consumers' demand that are coming by hook or by crook, and are part of the future that is in front of every one of us.
So thank you for that explanation. In fact, the benefit from GPSNR, from the SNR, varies from stakeholder to stakeholder. So that is well explained. Thank you for that. So Stefano, I have one more point to discuss. One of the constraints for smallholder farmers to adopt the sustainable practices is the high cost of certification. I mean, the initial cost as well as the annual recurring cost for the renewal of the certification. Could you please explain the prevailing system for accreditation and sustainability certification of rubber holdings? So what is the role of GPSNR in the certification?
Sure, thanks for that. I think that's a very important questions, because there's sometimes some confusion on the role of GPSNR and the role of certification and what GPSNR is. So happy to clarify a bit about that. So certification has been in place for agricultural commodities for a number of years. Yeah, and when we look at natural rubber, we have some certifications that are coming from the timber certification that are applicable to natural rubber as well. Some of the most famous and noticed certification schemes in the space are the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, and as well as PEFC, the Program for Endorsement of Forest Certification. Yeah, and both of these are actually members of GPSNR. And this goes a long way in saying that GPSNR has not been started to reinvent the wheel on certification, yeah, and to invent a new system for certification. Yeah, we understand that certification is a good tool, yeah, and it's a tool that can be applied by some, yeah, and hopefully increasingly these standards are, as they are working currently, and they will be able to work on ways to make certification more of the norm, yeah, in the future. But while we do so, we understood within GPSNR that there's a need to coadjuvate this work of certification with slightly different approaches. Yeah, and this is what GPSNR is doing. So while I mentioned before, we are still designing our assurance model, and by assurance, I mean a way that companies and members can make claims and say things about the sustainability of their products that are verified. Yeah, so my rubber is good or is sustainable or is better because of X, Y, and Z, and this is the organization that is checking on my behavior. So this we call assurance. Yeah, we don't plan to take the certification road for this at the moment. Yeah, what we plan to do, and is in the blueprint that we have now looked into for our assurance model, is to look at this more from an industry perspective and understand risks first. So the idea is to understand risks at GPSNR level for our members and understand where risks are higher for members and where risks are lower from members in respect to our policy framework. So for example, you could be a member of GPSNR that is operating in an area where your risk of deforestation is maybe unfortunately very low. Yeah, because usually, I say unfortunately, because usually if your risk of deforestation is low, it means that where you're operating, there's no more forest left. Yeah, so your forest, the risk of deforestation is very low. So we would consider your risk low for your operations in that region. But maybe in the same region, your risk for imported illegal labor is very high. Yeah, so we would consider that as a high risk. And the idea is that GPSNR will have systems to verify that are different depending on the risk value. So if the risk is very low, you might be able to first party assess, or having, for example, a partnership with an NGO that is a member of GPSNR on the ground to verify your practices without needing to go through a third party audit. And you might need a third party audit only in the occasions where you have very high risk. Yeah. Also, we would like to put systems in place that are industry-wide systems to look at these risks. So instead of having a company doing the assessments and another company doing the same assessment for the same risk in the same location, but to be able to set these systems at the GPSNR level. Together with this, we want to have practices that are risk mitigation practices, so enabling, through capacity building and through actions to improve practices, the mitigation, so the lowering of the risk value at scale from the industry by collecting the resources, both financial and non-financial, from the industry at the GPSNR level. Yeah. So this is the system that GPSNR is setting up, and we still hope that certification will play a role in this. Yeah, through the certifications that are already members of GPSNR. Yeah, and standards, by ensuring that if a company, for example, is already certified, and if this certification is in line with the requirements of GPSNR, that the company will be able to already tick the boxes of at least some of the GPSNR requirements.
That's clear, Mr. Stefano. Thank you for the explanation, for clarifying that points. So now I'm handing over. So most of my discussion points are over. Now I understand that Mr. Param Prasad Rao, the CEO of Technobis, is having a few more points for discussion. Over to Mr. Param, CEO of Technobis, for discussing the points. Thank you.
Stefano, it's a really interesting discussion points. I think you gave us a lot of input onto the sustainable natural rubber. I'll be hitting a few additional points for the sake of understanding about the sustainable natural rubber. First of all, you work with RSPO, right? The palm oil. I think the sustainable practices, I think before natural rubber, I think palm oil is implemented more compared to the rubber industry. I think rubber industry came later. Is it right? Yeah.
Well, what I would say is that there's some commonalities, but also some differences in the way that the two commodities are produced. Yeah, I would say that the boom of palm oil was a boom that involved large developments by large companies, and this raised the attention on the commodity way more than the attention has been on rubber in terms of unsustainable practices. And I would think that that attention has played a big role in how fast the companies operating in palm have moved, in improving in terms of transparency. Yeah, I mean, in palm, for example, we see that suppliers lists are published, volumes are published. We have companies like Sime Darby, for example, that have even published the genome of their materials because of their willingness to share this with the industry to increase yields in a bid to decrease the need for expansion. Yeah, so there's of course companies there that see a huge also reputational benefit, yeah, and market benefit in having good sustainable practices now, rather than in the natural rubber world. But what I would say is that we've seen this development, yeah, starting in palm, going through soy, moving through beef, and if you look at these are the commodities that are at the higher contributors to deforestation globally, and natural rubber is not far down the list. So I really hope that we will take this opportunity, especially because natural rubber as a crop has such a huge potential to be really done sustainably without changing things so much. Yeah, and I hope the industry will jump, yeah, on the opportunity to do this before the pressure will build. Yeah. For sustainability in natural rubber, because we are not yet there, but I do think with the next rise in prices, which we likely see in the next few years, we will incur this risk, yeah, as an industry. There's of course a lot to learn from palm, especially when we look at the operations of larger companies. But natural rubber is also very different because, as I mentioned, at the beginning, and as you all well know, 85% of the production is coming from smallholders, so we cannot really expect smallholders to invest in sustainability in the way that the companies in palm that were producers have invested in sustainability in the beginning. And we need to really have an equitable and approach to how sustainability is financed in natural rubber. This is very important, and have a sense of shared responsibility of the sustainability of the industry.
Okay, GPSNR probably have studied global practices currently, various agricultural practices. Which country is really following is there a benchmark? This country is having sustainable practices more? Because if you look at Southeast Asia, you have palm oil, you have natural rubber, but based on your experience or your information, which country is really doing well in the sustainable practices, particularly in agriculture management? Yeah.
Sustainability is very broad, right? And I think it's difficult to say that there's a country that is sustainable and a country that is not. There are countries that have experienced issues in certain areas of sustainability that are by design of how the industry is operating in those countries different from others. Yeah. I mean, I think we all have seen, yeah, the reports that have come out from civil society organization around expansion on forest land. Yeah. And of course, countries that have had natural rubber development starting many years ago have less of these issues than the new markets. Yeah, and this is of course the case. Yeah, we also have seen that there are countries now that are developing more, that are coming out of agriculture as a mainstream of GDP contribution, for example, for the countries. And for those countries, now labor is becoming a big issue. Yeah, so labor in agriculture, and this means the potential of migrant illegal labor coming to fill in these roles. Yeah, I wouldn't say that there's a country that's doing best and a country that is doing worst. I also think that it would be a bad way to look at things. Yeah, when we're comparing our practices towards others, I think we should compare our practices to ourselves. Yeah, this is something that I do with me. Yeah, and I hope that we all do the same. Yeah, there's no way of improving oneself with comparing yourself to what you're doing against others. You should look at your gaps towards what are your goals and what are the things that you can do, and understand how best you can use your resources to fill those gaps as soon as possible and as best as possible. Yeah, that's the only way that I think we can look at sustainability in a meaningful way.
Yeah, my point of, I understand, of course, every country has a different way of dealing things. We always like to look at some model, countries. Okay, you can always look at the different, let's look at, I don't want to say which is the best and which is the bad. It's more about which countries that you need to, as a reference, to follow. Whether it is Thailand or Malaysia or in any other countries. That's my way of looking at it. So yeah. See, I think the sustainable natural rubber, I think it's a buzzword. Okay, I would say, and I think even every association, natural rubber association, also working on it. Okay, and do you have any collaborative efforts together with industry associations? They also wanted to, because they wanted to get a high value for the natural, sustainable SNR. Okay, so what is your working relationship with industry associations?
Sure, we have many industry associations that are members of GPSNR. Yeah, all associations can be part of GPSNR through our affiliate membership program. Yeah, so this means they can be part of the working groups and can be part of the discussions. Although associations do not have a voting right, yeah, that is left to the members of those associations, and this is to ensure that we don't. We have the right representation when we look at voting, yeah, and we clearly understand positions, yeah. And for associations, sometimes this is a bit difficult, yeah. It's difficult even within GPSNR because you have many stakeholders, yeah, involved. So we have many that are members, and the door is open. So if any of the viewers are part of an association that is not yet a member of GPSNR, the door is open. We're also exploring ways of doing collaboration through other means. Yeah, you don't necessarily need to be a member. We have collaboration with multi-stakeholder initiatives in other commodities, for example. We have programs that we're doing in partnerships with, for example, RSPO and Bonsucro, yeah, on impact assessment for sustainable development. We also have collaborations with intergovernmental organizations. Yeah, for example, we have a memorandum of understanding with the International Rubber Study Group. Yeah, that is working well together with us in building a bridge to governments and government facilities. Yeah, so I think, yeah, from my perspective, I do think that collaboration is the best way to preserve oneself, yeah, and thrive. So GPSNR is always very open to collaboration with all parties, yeah.
Some of the members are tire manufacturers, right? And I'm sure that they also have their own plantations. Do you have any information about how sustainable practices they're implementing in their plantations? I think some of them have in Africa or in different parts of the world. Okay, so
sure. Yeah. So, well, what I can say is that when a member joins, that is, for example, a tire makers, but they do have plantation, their policies will need to align also in the context of their natural rubber production practices. Yeah. So this is the case for some of the major tire makers that own plantations at the moment. So they're starting now by having policies for production that are in line with our policy framework. Yeah. As I mentioned, we are developing implementation guidance, so we're gonna help these companies in following practices that are in line with GPSNR, also in their implementation. And I'll wait to respond to you on how they're operating when we get the responses from our first reporting requirements that are coming, will be coming at the end of this year. Yeah. So we'll be seeing how the companies align with the requirements of the policy framework and understand what are the gaps and understand how we can fill those gaps. But I'm happy to see that there's already a lot of commitment towards better practices from these companies through the alignment with the policy, through the implementation guidance, and through the willingness of reporting and in the future more and more transparently about their operations and their and their practices.
Yeah, because the tire manufacturer, they know the value of sustainable natural rubber, I think, and if they are doing a sustainable practices or in their agro management, that would be a good benchmark for the farmers, smallholders, or whether even the plantations all around the world, because they know the value what is a sustainable means actually compared to the farmers always look at what is good price today, right? They look at whether I'm getting sufficient price today or not, that is, or today or tomorrow, but the industry look at image, industry look at the quality of the product, and number of ways they look in about sustainability. It's interesting.
Sure.
It would be nice to
and
share,
if I can, yeah. If I can just add to that, I also think that there's a very different context on a plantation that is an industrial plantation and the farmers and smallholder plantation. And I do think we are starting to see some examples of farmers that are for example, implementing agroforestry systems in their plantations, which is something that might be and has been proven so far to be a bit more difficult to implement in large-scale plantations. Yeah, and this could be a great incentive for farmers to even be able to go one step above what companies can do. Yeah, while taking an approach that will help them in diversifying their income, which is something that companies are doing at another level. And to do it on their plantation. So yeah, I think there are some aspects of industrial plantations that farmers should look at. Yeah, in terms of the use of clonal material, for example, that is still not so widespread in certain regions. Yeah, understand what are good agricultural practices in terms of maintaining these trees and how to apply inputs and fertilizers. But when we look at agroforestry, there's a whole new spectrum of things, and some of the farmers that I visited, for example, in southern Thailand, it's incredible the knowledge that farmers have when they see their work with passion. Yeah, and I think this is something that is part of sustainability, that in the past years, we've driven farmers to look at their crops just as a means for a financial reward. And of course, this is very important, don't get me wrong. But I see that when passion comes into play, and when there's a passion about their job, yeah, that farmers can not only thrive in terms of the financial output, but also in terms of the technology advancement that they drive, in terms of the sustainability advancement that they drive, and they don't need a whole lot of industry support in terms of knowledge. Yeah, many of the times, because knowledge is available nowadays to farmers that want to look for it. What we need to do is support in terms of financial support, and support in terms of making sure that the industry is there to reward these sustainable practices. And this is, I think, what the best thing that we can do to support farmers' future. Yeah, especially in natural rubber.
It's true. It's true. Well, I have a question not related with the plantation thing. Your office is located in Singapore, and your global platform for sustainable natural rubber. Singapore does not produce natural rubber. Okay, why your office is located in Singapore, man?
That's exactly the reason why we're located in Singapore. Because can you imagine if we were placed or located in a country that is producing natural rubber, and what would be the highs and the size that we would get from the others? So I think the reason, I mean, it's partly that. Yeah, we wanted to be located in a place that is neutral in a way. Yeah. Okay. I also think that nowadays we put too much emphasis on where a company is located. Really, at the end of the day, it's really for practical reasons. Yeah, many of the companies that started GPSNR have offices in Singapore, and it seems like a place where we could get most of the members within one one small geographical area. Yeah. Also, it's quite easy to set up an organization, yeah, for many reasons. That's the thing. But I mean, I'm in Kuala Lumpur, for example. I have a team member that is in Mumbai. I have some that are in Singapore, and we're expanding in other regions, and everyone is working remotely. So I hope that we really consider ourselves as global citizens and operating in global organization nowadays.
Yes, Stefano. So thanks a lot in adding, addressing my points as well. Thank you very much. And Joe, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Param, for adding ice on the cake. Very good conversation. In fact, let me conclude this today's inner dialogue. So the information and insights shared by Mr. Stefano are extremely helpful for us to get a closer understanding of sustainable natural rubber, and it also provided help us to understand the opportunity it offers to various stakeholders, and also to understand the practical constraints in adopting the norms and criteria, and also it helped us to get some tips to overcome such constraints. So I understand that GPSNR is open to organize joint initiatives and special programs with the NR industry stakeholders in different countries. This is what we understood, what we are getting from the discussion. GPSNR is open, the doors are open to have joint initiatives or special programs with the NR industry stakeholders in different countries. That means the participants can contact GPSNR for any such programs and initiatives. Thank you once again, Mr. Stefano, for devoting your valuable time with us and the generous sharing of the insights. Thank you very much. Mr. Stefano, would you like to say something to the audience at this time?
Thank you very much, John and Peram, for this opportunity. Yeah, and I look forward to continuing this conversation both with you and with all of the audience. And I hope that you can reach out to me. The contacts are on the website of GPSNR. Look for it via Google. It's very easy. If you Google sustainable natural rubber, which would be the first result. And please feel free to contact me if you have any need for a follow-up, and I'll be able to, hopefully I'll be able to respond to your queries. But it's been a pleasure to talk to you all today. Thank you again very much.
Thank you, Mr. Stefano. Once again, thank you, Mr. Stefano. And now over to Mr. Peram for executing the remaining part of the program. Thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm heading over to Mr. Peram for executing the remaining part of the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. John Jacob, for excellent moderation and hosting this event with Stefano, Savi. I think now we all understand what is a sustainable natural rubber means, and what are the benefits, what are challenges, we've seen, and I think Stefano has given very broad and as well as informative information on the sustainable natural rubber. I'm hoping the participant benefited of this session today. Okay. I'd like to introduce to you, all of you, to our next episode is focusing on the Philippines natural rubber, which is scheduled on the 26th May and 4 p.m. Philippines. We have a 3 eminent rubber industry professionals from Philippines, Dr. Siti Jain and Mr. Gabriel Igot and Mr. Jack Sandik. So they will be talking about the challenges, opportunities in Philippines with reference to the natural rubber. I invite you all to participate in this episode and next schedule on the 26th May, 4 p.m. Philippines time. With that note, I thank you all for joining this session today. I'm hoping that you find this session useful, and see you next episode. Thank you all.